On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. You may be seated.
Well, grace to you and peace from God our Father and from the Lord Jesus Christ. It's good to see you this morning. Brett, if you could pull up that PowerPoint. I found my clicker, so we're good to go. All right. Well, it's good to see you this morning and appreciate you being here, both our members and our visitors. I wanted to begin this morning with a riddle. Don't do a lot of riddles. And if you're a Tolkien fan, you might already know the answer to this riddle, but maybe not. The riddle goes like this: this thing, all things devours, birds, beasts, trees, and flowers, gnaws iron, bites steel, grinds hard stones to meal, slays kings, ruins towns, and beats high mountains down. You know the answer? Anybody know the answer, what all things devours, other than the Tolkien fans out there? Time. It's time. Time devours everything. Birds, beasts, trees, flowers. It gnaws on iron, it bites steel, it grinds hard stones to meal, it slays kings and ruins towns and beats high mountains down. Is there anything more valuable than time? We kind of have a love-hate relationship with time, don't we? On one hand, we say, time heals all wounds. And so we wait for it to do its work whenever we're hurting. On the other hand, time creates wounds as it takes our loved ones away from us one after another. And as we see the wounds of time in our faces in the mirror, on one hand, time seems to stand still at our most painful moments. On the other hand, there doesn't seem to be enough time in the day. And so the Scripture tells us in Psalm 90 and verse 12 to teach us to number our days so that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Lord, help us to understand the value of time. Help us not to assume that tomorrow is going to come. Help us to learn the value of the moment. Because if we could do that, if we could understand how valuable this moment is, if we could learn how to number our days, we'd gain a heart of wisdom. Or as Paul put it in Ephesians 5 and verse 16, make the best use of every opportunity, the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. Because time is so precious and because life is so brief, when our Creator gives us these rules for life that we've been talking about within the Ten Commandments, it shouldn't surprise us that God has a rule about time, because time is so essential to life. And it's found in Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11 that Brian read just a moment ago. I'll read it again. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and the sea and all that's in them, and He rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Now, for those who maybe aren't as familiar with the Bible or with Jewish practices, the Sabbath, coming from the root word, which means to pause, and so he actually uses it in that way, to pause or to rest. the Sabbath was a weekly celebration on Saturday for the Jews and Israel, in which Israel was called to rest. And of course, as we see in this passage, it wasn't just the people that were called to rest, but their animals and their servants. Everyone was to have a weekly observation of rest on Saturday. And to violate this day of rest was a serious offense, and the consequence was death and stoning. Can you imagine for a moment, in our capitalistically driven society, if there was a federal law that took place tomorrow in which the government required all businesses to be closed on a given day? I think that that's probably something that Republicans and Democrats could unite in rejecting. I think both sides of the aisle would hate it because we're driven by profit. We can't stand the thought of the economy pausing for a moment. And interestingly enough, I remember when COVID first started and we were kind of isolated to our houses and not many people were working. Those first few days, when we just had some time to stop, it felt like the world literally stopped turning. I thought to myself, I think we may have needed this a little bit. Sabbath rest for the Israelites was more than just about resting, though, and doing it wasn't just like, hey, you get a day off to do whatever you want to do. Sabbath for the Israelites was about remembering. It was about reflecting. It was about reconnecting with God. It was about reorienting life in recognition of life being more than just labor. Life wasn't just about labor. Life was about the Lord. And the Sabbath caused them to remember that. The Sabbath wasn't the people's time, but it was God's time among the people. And whenever Isaiah is calling out the Israelites for their violation of the Sabbath, notice the way he puts it in Isaiah 58, verses 13 and 14. He says, if you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, now notice what he says here, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and you call the Sabbath a delight, and the holy day of the Lord honorable, if you honor it, not going your own ways or seeking your own pleasure or talking idly. Notice what he's saying. If you will turn back from using the Sabbath day just as your day to do what you want to do, talk about what you want to talk about, but he doesn't say it's not a delightful day. Notice what he says, you shall call the Sabbath a delight. It will be an enjoyable day for you when you honor it the way that it's meant to be honored. And then notice what he says will follow that. I will make you ride on the heights of the earth. I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Notice what he says. If you will do what you're supposed to do on this day of rest that I have given you, your life will be blessed. You will find a blessing. Even though it seems unnatural to stop working, even though it seems unnatural to pause for a day, even though it might create anxiety in you to not be doing something productive, God says, I'll bless you. Now, many of us probably realize this morning that we aren't bound by the restrictions of the Sabbath. Our holy day is not on Saturday. Paul talked about this in Colossians 2 and verse 16. We're not bound by the Sabbath laws. But this doesn't mean that we no longer have a holy day. And it also doesn't mean that God doesn't require us to rest. In fact, it should make us pause. It should make us pause for a moment and think, well, so God was just really deeply concerned with resting and reflecting on a given day, but all of a sudden when the new covenant started, God's like, I don't care, do what you want. Now, that should make us pause for a moment because that doesn't make sense. Something's not right there. More than ever, we need to recover the habit of making time for God. In a culture that has forgotten the purpose of time and the meaning of moments, the church must recover sacred time. Sacred time. So with that in mind, we're going to continue our series through the Ten Commandments that we've titled 10 Rules for Life, an Antidote for Chaos. And we're looking at rule number 3, which is make time for God. If you want to reduce the chaos in your life, you've got to learn how to make time for God. And the first thing I want us to consider is the concept of life and labor. Life and labor. Now, if you went to Google right now and you took a moment to Google the benefits of rest, maybe just put that into Google, the benefits of rest or the benefits of sleep, you're going to pull up like tons of different lists that are going to show you the benefits of resting and relaxing. And no doubt that there are many benefits. We're going to discuss that in our second point. Some people have so much chaos and stress in their life because they have no room to breathe. Their days are filled to the gills with labor, and life is little more than sweat and tears. Life feels like a machine that you put gas into at the beginning of the day and you're running on fumes at the end of the day. That's how some people live their lives, and maybe that's how you're living your life this morning. But on the other hand, there are those who live on the other side of the spectrum, who believe that life's great pursuit is one extended nap. They seek frivolity and fun, and they despise work and production. These individuals are apathetic, they're slothful, they're lazy. They're burdens to society because they refuse to seek and pursue daily work, good deeds, or community service. Their time is filled with personal pleasure, and they feel any infringement on their time is an affront to their comfort. And it's no surprise that while they enjoy brief pleasure, they find little enjoyment and purpose in life. They struggle with depression, with anxiety, and their faith quickly diminishes. These are individuals who despise work, and they have no concept of a work ethic, as we've used that phrase in the past. And so it's important for us to remember that the Sabbath is not an excuse for a lazy life. In fact, the whole reason that the Sabbath is valuable is because it is placed in the context of labor. Do you realize that one day of rest would mean really nothing if you're not doing anything every other day? Notice what he says in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 9. 6 days you, what? Shall labor. You shall labor. See, some people, they have chaos in their life because they don't know how to stop. They have hectic busyness, and their life is frayed, and they don't have any time for meaning or purpose. Their life has no meaning because they don't know how to stop. But there's other people who have no meaning and no purpose in their life because they don't know how to start. And we don't realize that labor, effort, working is good. It's good for us. When God created Adam, we are told that he put him in the garden to work it and to take care of it. Notice that. God creates man, and what does he do? Get to work. Now, we can talk about what all that means about tending the garden and taking care of it. But what that shows us is that work was a blessing in Eden. It wasn't a curse after the fall. Now, we'll talk about that in a moment, how work takes on a different meaning after the fall. But God's primary purpose for mankind was work. Work for the glory of God. And this means that a life well lived means a job well done. A life well lived means a job well done. And that shouldn't surprise us because the righteous servants on the day of judgment, Matthew 25 and 23, are told, what? Well done, faithful servant. You have been faithful over a few things. I will make you a master of many. And yet, the story of creation also reminds us that labor well done, meaningful work, as we sometimes say, it can turn into what we might refer to as toil. It can turn into a burden. And this happens when we don't submit to God's rules for our life. In Genesis 3 and verse 17, God tells Adam that this labor that I gave you as a blessing is now going to be toil. You're going to have thorns to deal with. You're going to sweat. Man's curse from God was that his purpose would now be difficult. What he previously enjoyed with some struggle now is given rather than ease. Now, at the same time, God didn't want life's man reduced to toil. Yes, this is a consequence of the fall, but he did not want to reduce man to simply working till the day that he dies and never remembering that there was a greater purpose. And so what does he do? On Genesis 2 and verse 3, we're told that God himself rested and he made a sacred, holy day in order to remind man that yes, life is difficult. Yes, work is difficult. It can have great meaning and purpose, but that's not the only thing you were created for. You were created for me, for the Lord. So what then does this mean for us today? Let's consider that as we consider rest and remembrance. Although we don't worship on Saturday, obviously that's not our holy day, what should stand out to us about the Ten Commandments is that God is greatly concerned with two things. What should stand out to us from the Sabbath law is that God is greatly concerned with two things. Number one, he is concerned with people taking time to rest. And number two, he is concerned with people taking time to honor him. Specifically within the context of other people. When we come to the New Testament, we see that Jesus came calling people to rest in him. Do you remember what he said in Matthew 11 and verse 28? Come to me, all those who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you what? Rest. I will give you a Sabbath. And he came in John 10 and verse 10, he says to give abundant life. So if Jesus came to give rest and Jesus came to give abundant life, what that tells me is that the abundant life is about learning how to rest. Is the abundant life really a life lived without restraint? Is the abundant life Jesus is offering us about boundless labor without ever taking a moment to breathe? Does that sound like an abundant life to you? For those of you who have worked long hours, I remember when I was in preaching school and we would get behind on our work and the quarter was coming to the end and we had to have, I'm sure that Adam had these too, you had sleepless nights, you had to stay up all night and get this work done. Then you had to take a test the next day, maybe take a quick hour nap, get back to work. And it was hard to tell reality from the dreamland in those days. But when you have to do that type of labor, you know that you don't function well. And you certainly wouldn't want to live your life that way. Life isn't manageable or enjoyable when we're burning both ends of the candle. So what do we see in the New Testament then? Well, we see that God's new people, Christians, both Jew and Gentile alike, do have a special day. A holy day. This is a holy day. I know that we're not used to thinking in those terms, but holy means set apart and sacred. And this, brethren, Sunday is a sacred day. It is what John called in Revelation 1 and verse 10, the Lord's Day, in which people of God spend time together resting, worshiping, and reflecting on God. In fact, the people of God were doing it so consistently in the New Testament that he could depend upon them being at the same place at the same time in order to give their contributions. This is what he's talking about in 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 and 2, when he says, when you come together on the first day of every week, make sure to bring your contributions so that there will be no gatherings when I come. Notice, he's depending upon the fact that they are habitually meeting together on Sunday so that when he swings through town, he can just quickly swing by and grab the contributions rather than go from house to house and get them from people. They were doing it so consistently, in fact, that the Hebrews writer would condemn the habitual forsaking of such as a sin in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 25, where he says, "Don't forsake the assembling of ourselves together, as is the habit of some." He says some have got in the habit of forsaking the assembling, of rejecting the holy day. And he says, don't do that. In fact, this is what we witnessed within the early centuries following the first century. Justin Martyr, in his writings, he was writing around 150 AD or so, we have some insight into what early Christian worship looked like through these early church fathers. And notice what he says. He says, "But Sunday is the day on which we all hold our common assembly, because it is the first day on which God, having wrought a change in the darkness and matter, made the world, and Jesus Christ our Savior on the same day rose from the dead. For he was crucified on the day before that of Saturn, or Saturday, and on the day after that of Saturn, which is the day of the sun, having appeared to his apostles and disciples, he taught them those things which we have submitted for your consideration." Notice what he's saying. This is Justin Martyr, who's writing 70 years or so after the death of John the Apostle. And notice what he is saying is their common practice, to come together on the first day of the week as an assembly of God's people. For the Israelites, the Sabbath was a weekly remembrance of God's great works. It was a tangible sharing in the rest that he gave from their oppressors in the land of promise. And so for the Israelites, to neglect this day was to reject his promise. It was to live with ingratitude towards God. To reject the Sabbath was to refuse to relinquish control. It was to refuse to trust that God would provide, that he was working even when we weren't. It was a refusal to believe that man lives not by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And it was a refusal to believe that life is more than food and the body is more than clothing. And so when you rejected the Sabbath, you rejected all of those things. You rejected trust in God. You rejected in his provision. You rejected his promises. You rejected all that he was wanting to offer you. And if that is the case, brethren, if it is the case, do we seriously think that God is going to take the rejection and apathy which so many have towards the new holy day, Sunday, any less serious than that of the Sabbath? Do we seriously think that God in the Old Covenant, before his Son came to this world, took this Sabbath day really seriously, but then as soon as the culminating act of history, the greatest work that has ever been done, the crucifixion and the resurrection of his Son, the greatest act of history that God has ever done, that after that, he said, I don't really care what you do. You do what you do. You want to go to church? Go to church. You don't want to go to church? Don't go to church. Do what you want to do. Do we seriously think that that is how God operates? Or are we the ones who have gone off track? Are we the ones who have forgotten? Are we the ones who no longer treat with reverence the day that God has called us to treat with reverence? This is a serious deal, and one that we don't take seriously enough. If the Sabbath violation was worthy of stoning, what more will happen to those, especially Christians, who consistently and habitually and intentionally neglect to meet and worship God on his day? I'm being serious here. This isn't me. This is the Lord. A failure to hold Sunday as holy for the Christian and to consistently and habitually reject worship on Sunday. That type of failure is a failure of the soldier failing to report for duty. It is the failure of the child refusing to come to dinner with the father. It is the failure of the servant rejecting their obligation to the master. It is the citizen refusing the summons of their king. Not only are we refusing to recognize and honor God, but it is a rejection of the life which God offers to His people. It is a reduction of life to nothing more than work and toil, and it forgets that existence transcends the daily meal. And that is why communist states, for example, when communist governments try to impose their will on the people, do you know the first thing they do? They shut down the churches. You know why? Because they have to reduce man to believing that he is nothing more than labor and the profit that he gains from it. And let me tell you, brethren, America has made that mindset a lot easier. Because we have reduced ourselves to what we can produce and what we can consume and the comfort that comes from it and nothing more. And I'm telling you, it's because we have forgot God's sacred day. We have forgotten that time does not belong to us. It belongs to Him. So, if we want to grasp all that God has given us, we must take the time to actually open our hands. We must do as the psalmist says in Psalm 46 and verse 10, be still and know that I'm God. The word there, be still, in the Hebrew literally means to let your hands hang loose. It brings with it the idea of the person who is constantly, anxiously wringing their hands, fretting over work, fretting over life, fretting over the future, worrying about tomorrow, worrying about what will come. And the psalmist says, God says to us, He says, let your hands down. Be still. And know that I am God. If He is God, brethren, do you know what that means? You are not. If He is God, I am not. And I have no control over tomorrow. I have no control over time. But He does. And if we forget that, we will forget what life is about. And this is ultimately what God is gifting us on Sunday. To stop and to share in the rest He offers us in Jesus Christ, which looks forward to the rest that He will give us in heaven, Hebrews 4 and verse 1. We should not see Sunday as an obligation, but an opportunity. Not an impediment to life, but an invitation to know life as it is meant to be, within the rhythm of work and rest. And while Christians don't have the oppressive restrictions of Sabbath, we should still guard against working on Sunday unless absolutely necessary. We certainly should not allow our schedules to be obligated by the dictates of labor to where we are intentionally scheduling work on Sunday, and especially in relationship to forsaking the assembly. We should do all that we can, unless it is absolutely necessary, to be where we are called to be as God's people on Sunday. Now, listen, past generations understood this. Past generations understood this. We have to learn how to reclaim it. You know, this sermon in the past would have been a cakewalk. But I know some of you right now are offended by it. I know some of you right now are angry at it. But Christians are people who recognize that time belongs to God. And one of the ways that we do that is by honoring Sunday. Christians should let their bosses know, their managers know, that Sunday is not an option. When they're coming to apply for a new job, you give the opportunity. What days can you work? I cannot work on Sunday. Sporting events, secular activities should always come second to worship. Because Sunday is not for our pleasure, but for God's. The fact that we struggle with this And the fact that we're so offended by it shows how worldly the church has become. We see Sunday as a healthy option. Yeah, if you can go, you can go. Hey, I think church is good, just like any, Lions meeting, Lions Club meeting, or relaxing day at the spa. If that does, if that helps you, good for you, go. We view church as a healthy option rather than a divine obligation. But brethren, if you want to conquer the chaos in your life, you're going to have to learn how to make time for God. To rest, to reconnect, to reflect. And that does not happen without intention, and it doesn't happen without sacrifice. How do you spend your time? Isn't that interesting that we often use economic language in relationship to time? How do you spend your time? Or we might say, they have wasted a lot of time. And I think that we use that language because we place a lot of value on money, and it hurts when we lose money or when we invest our money in a bad way. There's a lot of people investing their time in bad ways. And a lot of us are wasting time. Recently, a couple of years ago, I don't have my iPhone on me, but the iPhone started doing this thing called screen time, and it lets you know how much time you spent on your phone the previous week. I don't really understand the purpose of that, but let me tell you, it's pretty humbling. I remember the first time that it popped up on my phone, I thought, there is no way in this world that I spent that much time on my phone this last week, But then it has like a report that you can look at. All the time that we spend. The Bureau of Labor Statistics did a study a few years ago, and they looked at how the average American spends their time. 8 hours a day working, however many hours a day sleeping, but then they broke under working, what they spend their time doing during work. And then interestingly enough, as a part of that statistic, they said, how much time does the average American in their day think about God? How much time does the average American spend with God? Some kind of either prayer or scripture or just thinking about God. And they found that the average American spends 3 minutes. 3 minutes with God. For those, and this is with those who claim to be religious. We spend more time reading a news story or flipping through social media than we do with God. If that's the case, do we wonder why our lives are filled with such chaos? And if that's the case, I think that we can afford to spend a couple of hours a week on Sunday remembering and thanking our Creator, not only to honor Him, but also to enjoy the abundant life which He gifts us through Jesus, His Son. These are the rules of life. And the only way to live abundantly is to make time for God. You are more than your labor, and I hope you know that I tell you that because I love you. You're more than your work. You're more than your stuff. And one way to remind yourself of that every week is to be here every Sunday. Stopping for a moment and reflecting and recognizing that time doesn't belong to you. It belongs to Him. Why don't you use your time this morning to respond to that God, to seek His rest, to receive Him as your Lord, to be baptized into Christ? Whatever your need is, why don't you come? Together we stand as we sing.